Section 13. German controversies and the 30 Years' War. It was the misfortune of Lutheranism that it had no other bond of union between its representatives in its several territories than agreement in pure doctrine, and that differences in apprehension were regarded as incompatible with Christian fellowship. The original Lutheran conception of a faith which constitutes a new personal relationship between God and the believing soul tended to shade off into a belief which, as Melanchthon once defined it, is an assent by which you accept all articles of the faith. The result was a new Protestant scholasticism. Melanchthon, influenced by humanistic thought, gradually moved from his original agreement with Luther to some emphases different from those of his greater colleague. By 1527 he had lost sympathy with Luther's denial of human freedom and had reached the conclusion that salvation is only possible through the cooperant action of the will of man, a view to which the name, synergism, is usually given. By 1535 he was emphasizing good works, not as the price of salvation, but as its indispensable evidence. Regarding the Lord's Supper, he came to feel that Luther had overemphasized Christ's physical presence and, without quite reaching Calvin's position, page 394, to hold that Christ is given, not in the bread, but with the bread, that is, to lay stress on the spiritual rather than the physical reception. These differences never made a breach with Luther, partly because of Luther's generous affection for his younger friend, and partly because of Melanchthon's caution in their expression, though they made Melanchthon uncomfortable at times in Luther's presence during that reformer's later years. They were to cause trouble enough in the Lutheran communions. One chief cause of bad feeling was Melanchthon's reluctant consent to the Leipzig Interve, in 1548. To Melanchthon many Roman practices then reintroduced were non-essentials. To Matthias Flacius Illyricus and Nikolaus von Amsdorf, in the security of Magdeburg, nothing could be non-essential in such a time, page 380. They attacked Melanchthon bitterly, and perhaps he deserved some of their blame. This strain was soon increased by the feeling of the princes of the old deprived Saxon electoral line that Melanchthon, by remaining in Wittenberg, which now belonged to their successful despoiler, Moritz, was guilty of desertion of a family which had faithfully supported him, and they magnified the school in Jena, making it a university in 1558, and appointing Flacius to one of its professorships. Other theological disputes arose. Andreas Osiander, 14981552, roused the opposition of all other Lutheran parties by declaring, with Paul, that the sinner receives actual righteousness from the indwelling Christ, and is not simply declared righteous. George Major, 1502–1574, affirmed, in essential agreement with Melanchthon, the necessity of good works as evidences of salvation. In 1552 he was bitterly assailed by Amsdorf, who went so far as to assert that good works are a hindrance to the Christian life. The same year saw a fierce attack on Melanchthon's doctrine of the Lord's Supper by Joachim Westphal, 1510–1574, as Eripto-Calvinism, or Calvinism surreptitiously introduced. It is not surprising that shortly before his death, which occurred on April 19, 1560, Melanchthon gave as a reason for his willingness to depart, that he might escape the rage of the theologians. The Protestant situation in Germany was soon after further turmoiled by the victorious advance of Calvinism into the southwest. Frederick III, 1559–1576, the excellent Elector Palatine, was led by studies of the discussions regarding the Lord's Supper to adopt the Calvinist position. For his territories the young theologians, Caspar Olevianus, 1536–1587, and Zacharias Ursinus, 1534–1583, prepared the remarkable Heidelberg Catechism in 1562, the most sweet-spirited and experiential of the expositions of Philippism, was vigorously repressed. Yet this struggle gave rise, in 1577, to the last great Lutheran creed, the Formula of Concord. Prepared by a number of theologians, of whom Jacob André, 1528–1590, of Tübingen, Martin Chemnitz, 1522–1586, of Brunswick, and Nikolaus Sellnecker, 1530–1592, of Leipzig were chief, it was put forth, after infinite negotiation, in 1580, on the 50th anniversary of the Augsburg Confession, with the approving signatures of 51 princes, 35 cities, and between 8 and 9,000 ministers. A number of Lutheran princes and cities refused their approval, but it undoubtedly represented the decided majority of Lutheran Germany. Not as extreme as Flacius and Amsdorf, it represents the stricter Lutheran interpretation. It is minute, technical, and scholastic in marked contrast to the freshness of the Augsburg Confession half a century before. The period of Lutheran high orthodoxy had begun, which was to have its classic exposition in 1622, through the loci theologic of Johann Gerhard, 1582–1637, of Jena. Its scholasticism was as complete as any in the Middle Ages. Under this repression, the Philippists turned increasingly to Calvinism, and Calvinism made larger inroads in Germany. To the Palatinate, Nassau was added in 1577, Bremen by 1581, Anhalt in 1597, and part of Hesse in the same period. The Electoral House of Brandenburg, from which the present German imperial line is descended, became Calvinist in 1613, though most of the inhabitants of Brandenburg remained Lutheran. This transformation was often accompanied by the retention of the Augsburg Confession. Yet though these German Reformed churches became Calvinist in doctrine and worship, Calvin's characteristic discipline found little foothold among them. Protestantism in Germany reached its flood tide of territorial advance about 1566. From that time it began to ebb. The revived Catholicism of the Counter-Reformation became increasingly aggressive, led by the Jesuits and supported by earnest Catholic princes like the Dukes of Bavaria. Divided Protestantism could not offer united resistance. In Bavaria, Duke Albert V, 1550–1579, vigorously applied the principle cujus regio, aegis religio, to crush his Protestant nobility and people. The abbot of Fulda similarly attempted the repression of Protestantism in his territories in 1572. Successfully opposed for a time, he effected his task in 1602. Similar Catholic restorations were effected in the Protestantized territories belonging to the archbishoprics of Mainz and Trier. Under Jesuit leadership similar Catholic advances were made in other bishoprics, the inhabitants of which had embraced evangelical views. The Archbishop of Cologne, Gebhard Truchsess, one of the 7 electors, proposed to marry, in 1582, and embraced Protestantism. Little help came to him. He was forced from his strategically situated see, and the territory fully restored to Catholicism. In Austria and Bohemia the situation became steadily more unfavorable for Protestantism, and there as well as elsewhere in the empire the Jesuit propaganda gained many individual converts. It was aggressive and confident of ultimate victory. The situation between Protestants and Catholics was constantly strained. An event of the years 1606 to 1607 markedly increased this bitterness. The city of Donauwörth was overwhelmingly Protestant, yet Catholic monasteries had been there allowed. A Catholic procession of 1606 was stoned. On imperial command, Maximilian, the able Catholic Duke of Bavaria, 1597–1651, occupied the city and began a repression of its evangelical worship. At the Reichstag of 1608 the Catholics demanded the restitution of all ecclesiastical property confiscated since 1555. For this claim they had the strict letter of the law and the Peace of Augsburg, but many of these districts had become, in the 2 generations that had elapsed, solidly Protestant in population. Under these circumstances a number of protesta. Ion which cost thousands of lives, and was equally entertained by Catholics and Protestants, was at its worst between 1580 and 1620. The actual outbreak of the 30 Years' War came from Bohemia. That then largely Protestant land had wrung from its king, the Emperor Rudolf II, 1576–1612, in 1609, a charter the Maystatsbrief granting a high degree of toleration. Rudolf was succeeded, both as emperor and king, by his feeble brother Matthias, king, 1611–1619, emperor, 1612–1619, but he was childless, and in 1617 his cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, a strenuous representative of the Counter-Reformation, succeeded in securing recognition as Matthias's successor from the Bohemian estates. Catholic influences were augmented, and in May, 1618, a party of disaffected Protestants flung the 2 Catholic regents representing the absent Matthias from a high window in Prague. This act put Bohemia into rebellion and began the war. Its commencement was favorable for the Bohemian insurgents, and in 1619, after the death of Matthias, they elected the Calvinist, Frederick V. 1610–1632, Elector Palatine, their king. The same week Ferdinand of Styria was chosen emperor as Ferdinand II, 1619–1637. Frederick found little support outside of Bohemia, and now Maximilian of Bavaria and a Spanish force from the Netherlands came to Ferdinand's assistance. Under the command of a Walloon general, Jan Cerclas, Baron Tilly, 1559–1632, this Catholic combination overwhelmed the Bohemian forces, near Prague, on November 8, 1620. Frederick fled the land. The Majestitsbrief was annulled, the property of Bohemian Protestants largely confiscated, to the great financial advantage of the Jesuits, and the Counter-Reformation enforced with a high hand in Bohemia, Moravia, and Austria. Among those enriched by the acquisition of confiscated property was one destined to play a great part in the further history of the war, Albrecht von Wallenstein, 1583–1634. The Union was dissolved. A similar repression of Protestantism now took place in Austria. Meanwhile Spanish troops, under Spinola, had invaded the Palatinate in 1620, and thither Tilly and the army of the League soon followed. The land was conquered, Catholicism enforced, and Frederick's electoral title with a good share of the Palatinate transferred to Maximilian of Bavaria in 1623. Northwestern Germany, where many bishoprics had become Protestant possessions since the Peace of Augsburg, was now threatened with war, and the disasters to Protestantism which had already happened aroused Protestant foreign powers. Nothing effective was done, however, except by Christian IV of Denmark, to whom England and the Protestant Netherlands sent some slight aid. To the Emperor Ferdinand the enmity of the Danish king seemed formidable, and he therefore turned to Wallenstein to raise a new army as imperial commander-in-chief. This remarkable adventurer, born a Protestant, was nominally a Catholic, and now the richest noble of Bohemia. A natural leader of men, he raised an army in which he asked no questions of race or creed, but simply of capacity to fight, and loyalty to himself. He soon had a force of great efficiency. On April 25, 1626, Wallenstein defeated the Protestant army under Ernst of Mansfeld, at the Dessau Bridge over the Elbe, following the beaten forces to Hungary, whither they retreated in the vain hope of making effective stand in conjunction with the emperor's enemy, Bethlen Gabor, Prince of Transylvania. On August 27, 1626, Christian IV of Denmark was beaten by Tilly and the army of the League at Lutter. These successes were followed up by the Catholics in 1627 and 1628. Hanover, Brunswick, and Silesia were conquered, then Holstein, Schleswig, Pomerania, and Mecklenburg. Wallenstein found it impossible to capture the Baltic seaport of Stralsund, which was aided by the Swedes, and thought it wise to make peace before the able Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, 1611–1632, might interfere. Accordingly, Christie, headed by Maximilian of Bavaria, by reason of the great increase in imperial power which Wallenstein had effected, now led to a successful demand by the League that Wallenstein be dismissed. In September, 1630, the emperor was compelled to part with his able general. Even before Wallenstein's dismissal an event of prime importance had occurred, though its consequences were not immediately apparent. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden with a small army had landed on the German coast on June 26, 1630. Two motives induced his interference in the war. He came undoubtedly as a champion of the Protestant faith, but he also desired to make the Baltic a Swedish lake, and he saw in the imperial attacks on the German Baltic seaports an immediate danger to his own kingdom. Should they be held by a hostile power, Sweden would be in great peril. Gustavus soon succeeded in driving the imperial forces out of Pomerania, but he moved slowly, since he had no adequate allies. In January, 1631, however, he entered into a treaty with France, then under the masterful leadership of Louis XIII Great Minister, Armand Duplessis, Cardinal Richelieu, 1585–1642, by which considerable financial subsidies were granted. Richelieu had resumed the historic hostility of France to the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, and the ancient French policy of aiding their enemies for the political advantage of the French monarchy, even if those enemies were Protestants. Gustavus's next important and difficult work was to secure the alliance of Brandenburg, which, though Protestant, had been imperialist, and of Saxony, which had been neutral. On May 20, 1631, Tilly captured Magdeburg, the inhabitants being treated with brutal ferocity. This loss of a great Protestant stronghold was followed by an alliance in June between Gustavus and the Elector of Brandenburg, and in August Saxony threw off its neutrality and joined the Swedes. On September 17, 1631, Gustavus, with little real help from the Saxons, won a great victory over Tilly at Bredenfeld, close by Leipzig. The imperial power in northern Germany crumbled, and the Swedish king marched victoriously to the Rhine, establishing himself in Mainz, while the Saxons took Prague. In his extremity, the emperor called on Wallenstein once more to raise an army, and in April, 1632, that general was at the head of a redoubtable force. Gustavus now marched against Maximilian of Bavaria, defeating Tilly in a battle near Donauwörth, in which that commander was mortally wounded. Munich, the Bavarian capital, had to surrender to the Swedish king. Meanwhile Wallenstein had driven the Saxons out of Prague, and marched to meet Gustavus. For some weeks the two armies faced each other near Nuremberg, but the fighting was indecisive, and Wallenstein marched northward to crush Saxony. Gustavus followed him, and defeated him at Litzen, near Leipzig, on November 16, 1632, in a fierce battle in which Gustavus was slain. His work was enduring. He had made the Edict of Restitution a dead letter in northern Germany, and his memory is deservedly cherished by German Protestantism. The control of Swedish affairs passed to the able Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, though the most capable Protestant general was now Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, 1604–1639. In November, 1633, Bernhard captured the important South German city of Regensburg, and opened the line of the Danube to Protestant advance. Meanwhile Wallenstein had remained comparatively inactive in Bohemia, partly jealous of large Spanish forces which had been sent to southern Germany, and partly intriguing with Saxony, Sweden, and France. Just what he had in mind is uncertain, but the most probable supposition is that he aimed to secure for himself the crown of Bohemia. His failure to relieve Regensburg was the last straw in rousing the suspicious hostility of the emperor, and on February 25, 1634, he was murdered by his own soldiers as a result of imperial intrigue. On September 5 and 6, 1634, Bernhard A. savagely as ever. Its original aims were practically lost, and it became a struggle, fought out on German soil with the aid of German parties, for the aggrandizement of Spain, France, and Sweden, in which France gained most. Ferdinand II was succeeded by his son, Ferdinand III, 1637–1657, but the change brought no real alteration of the situation. Germany lacked men of real leadership, the only conspicuous exception being Frederick William the Great Elector, 1640–1688, of Brandenburg, but though he succeeded in enlarging his territorial possessions, he was too young largely to affect the course of the war. At last, after infinite negotiation, the Peace of Westphalia was made on October 27, 1648. Sweden was firmly settled on the German shore of the Baltic. Most of Alsace went to France. The long-existing independence of Switzerland was formally acknowledged. Brandenburg received the Archbishopric of Magdeburg and the bishoprics of Halberstadt and Minden as compensation for surrender of its claims on part of Pomerania to the Swedes. Maximilian of Bavaria kept his title of Elector and part of the Palatinate, while the rest of the Palatinate was restored to Karl Ludwig, son of the unfortunate Frederick V, for whom a new electoral title was created. More important was the religious settlement. Here the ability of the Great Elector secured the inclusion of the Calvinists who, with the Lutherans, were regarded as one party as over against the Catholics. German Calvinists at last secured full rights. The Edict of Restitution was fully abandoned and the year 1624 taken as the norm. Whatever ecclesiastical property was then in Catholic or Protestant hands should so remain. While the power of a lay sovereign to determine the religion of his subjects still remained, it was modified by a provision that where divided religious worship had existed in a territory in 1624, each party could continue it in the same proportion as then existed. Between Lutherans and Calvinists it was agreed that the norm should be the date of the peace, and that a change of the lay ruler to one or the other form of Protestantism thereafter should not affect his subjects. On the other hand, by the insistence of the emperor, no privileges were accorded to Protestants in Austria or Bohemia. Neither side liked the peace. The Pope denounced it. But all were tired of the war, and the peace had the great merit of drawing the lines between Catholicism and Protestantism roughly, but approximately, where they really stood. As such, it proved essentially permanent, and with it the period of the Reformation on the continent may be considered closed. To Germany the 30 Years' War was an unmitigated and frightful evil. The land had been plowed from end to end for a generation by lawless and plundering armies. Population had fallen from 16 millions to less than 6. Fields were waste. Commerce and manufacturing destroyed. Above all, intellectual life had stagnated, morals had been roughened and corrupted, and religion grievously maimed. A century after its close the devastating consequences had not been made good. Little evidence of spiritual life was manifested in this frightful time of war, yet to it, in large part, and reflecting the trust of heartfelt piety in its stress, belongs the work of perhaps the greatest of Lutheran hymn writers, Paul Gerhardt, 1607–1676. In its earlier years, also, lie the chief activities of that strange and deep Protestant mystic, Jacob Boehme, 1575–1624, of Gorlitz. The Reformation age exhibited a number of departures from traditional orthodoxy regarding the person and work of Christ. Though not characteristic of Anabaptists, in general, their earliest manifestation is to be found among such Anabaptists as Denk and Hetzer, Anti, page 369. Servetus's radical opinions and tragic fate have already been noted, Anti, page 399, but this ingenious thinker founded no school of disciples. The chief anti-Trinitarians of the age came from Ned. To give their name to the movement were the two Sozzinis, uncle and nephew. Lelio Sozzini, Socinus, 1525–1562, was of a prominent Sienese family and a student of law. His opinions were at first evangelical, and he lived for a year, 1550–1551, in Wittenberg, enjoying Melanchthon's friendship. Among other Swiss cities, he was well received in Geneva, and settled in Zurich, where he died. Servetus's execution turned his attention to the problem of the Trinity, but his speculations were not made public in his lifetime. His more distinguished nephew Fausto, 1539–1604, was in Lyons in 1561 and Geneva in 1562. Although already a radical and influenced, though less than has often been represented, by his uncle's notes and papers, Fausto conformed outwardly to the Roman Church and lived from 1563 to 1575 in Italy. Thence he removed to Basel, till he went to Transylvania, in 1578, at the instance of Biandrata. The next year saw him in Poland, where he lived till his death in 1604. Thanks to the labors of Fausto Sozzini and others in Poland, the party gained considerable foothold, and expressed its belief effectively in the Rakovian Catechism, on which Fausto had labored, published in 1605, in Rakow, the city from which it took its name and in which these Polish brethren had their headquarters. The Catechism is a remarkable combination of rationalistic reasoning and a hard supernaturalism. The basis of truth is the Scriptures, but confidence in the New Testament is based primarily on the miracles by which its promulgation was accompanied and especially by the crowning miracle of the resurrection. The New Testament, thus supernaturally attested, guarantees the Old Testament. The purpose of both is to show to man's understanding the path to eternal life. Though there may be in them matters above reason, there is nothing of value contrary to reason. The only faith that they demand is belief that God exists and is a recompenser and a judge. Man is by nature mortal and could not find the way to eternal life of himself. Hence God gave him the Scripture and the life and example of Christ. Christ was a man, but one who lived a life of peculiar and exemplary obedience, filled with divine wisdom, and was therefore rewarded with a resurrection and a kind of delegated divinity, so that he is now a hearer of prayer. The Christian life consists in joy in God, prayer and thanksgiving, renunciation of the world, humility and patient endurance. Its consequences are forgiveness of sins and eternal life. Baptism and the Lord's Supper are to be retained as commanded by Christ and possessing a certain symbolic value. Man's essential freedom is asserted, and original sin and predestination denied. The most successful portion of the Socinian polemic was its attack on the satisfaction theory of the atonement, which the Reformers had universally accepted. Satisfaction is no demand of God's nature. Forgiveness and satisfaction are mutually exclusive conceptions. It is absolute injustice that the sins of the guilty be punished on the person of the innocent. Christ's death is a great example of the obedience which every Christian should, if necessary, manifest, but that obedience was no greater than he owed for himself, and he could not transfer its value to others. Could it be so transferred, in so far as a man felt himself thereby relieved from moral effort for righteousness, character would thereby be weakened. The relation of Socinianism to the later scholasticism, especially that of Scotus, is undoubted, but unlike that medieval system, it rejected all authority of the Church and found its source in the Scriptures, interpreted by reason. It rebelled against the prevailing views of human inability and total depravity. It did not a little to free religion from the bondage of dogma and to favor the unprejudiced study of Scripture, but it had almost no conception of what religion meant to Paul, Augustine, or Luther. A new, vital personal relationship between N.T. to Geneva at the expense of the Merchants' Guild of Amsterdam. In 1588, he entered on a pastorate in Amsterdam, winning distinction as a preacher and pastor of irenic spirit. In 1603 he was chosen to succeed the eminent Franz Junius, 1545–1602, as professor of theology in Leiden, where he remained till his death. Though indisposed to controversy, he was appointed in 1589 to reply to Kornhert and to defend the supralapsarian position against two ministers of Delft. The discussion last named had to do with the order of the divine purposes. Did God decree election and reprobation, and then permit the fall as a means by which the decree could be carried out, supralapsum? Or did he foresee and permit that man would fall, and then decree election as the method of saving some, infralapsum? As he studied the questions involved, Arminius came to doubt the whole doctrine of unconditional predestination and to ascribe to man a freedom, which, however congenial to Melanchthon, Ante, page 442, had no place in pure Calvinism. A bitter controversy sprang up between Arminius and his supralapsarian colleague in the university, Frans Gomarus, 1563–1641, and soon the Protestant Netherlands were widely involved. After Arminius's death, in 1609, the leadership of the party was taken by the court preacher Johann Tenbegart, 1557–1644, and by Simon Episcopius, 1583–1643, Arminius's friend and pupil, and soon to be professor of theology in Leiden. By them Arminian views were systematized and developed, and both opposed the current emphasis on minuity of doctrine, viewing Christianity primarily as a force for moral transformation. In 1610, they and other sympathizers to the number of 41, at the instance of the eminent Dutch statesman, Johann van Oldenbarnevelt, 1547–1619, a lover of religious toleration, drew up a statement of their faith called the Remonstrance, from which the party gained the name Remonstrance. Over against the Calvinist doctrine of absolute predestination, it taught a predestination based on divine foreknowledge of the use men would make of the means of grace. Against the doctrine that Christ died for the elect only, it asserted that he died for all, though none received the benefits of his death except believers. It was at one with Calvinism in denying the ability of men to do anything really good of themselves. All is of divine grace. Hence the Arminians were not Pelagians, Ante, page 185. In opposition to the Calvinist doctrine of irresistible grace, they taught that grace may be rejected, and they declared uncertainty regarding the Calvinist teaching of perseverance, holding it possible that men may lose grace once received. All the Protestant Netherlands were speedily filled with conflict. The vast majority of the people were Calvinists, and that view had the support of the Stadtholder Maurice, 1588–1625. The Remonstrants were favored by Oldenbarnevelt, the leader of the province of Holland, and by the great jurist and historian, the founder of international law, Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645. The dispute soon became involved in politics. The Netherlands were divided between the supporters of states' rights, which included the wealthier merchant classes and of which Oldenbarnevelt and Grotius were leaders, and the National Party of which Maurice was the head. The National Party now wished a national synod to decide the controversy. The province of Holland, under Oldenbarnevelt, held that each province could decide its religious affairs and resisted the proposal. Maurice, by a coup d'état in July, 1618, overthrew the States Rights Party. Oldenbarnevelt, in spite of his great services, was beheaded on May 13, 1619, and Grotius condemned to life imprisonment, from which he escaped in 1621. Meanwhile a national synod, called by the States General, held session in Dort from November 13, 1618, to May 9, 1619. Besides representatives from the Netherlands, delegates from England, the Palatinate, Hesse, Brem. Greater influence in England than in its homeland, and was to prove, in the person of John Wesley, its possibility of association with as warm-hearted and emotional a type of piety as any interpretation of Christian truth can exhibit. Out of this controversy there emerged from the pen of Grotius, in 1617, an important theory of the atonement. The view of Anselm had looked upon Christ's death as the satisfaction of the injured divine honor, ante, page 263. The Reformers had viewed it as the payment of penalty for sin to outrage divine justice on behalf of those for whom Christ died, and had represented the exaction of penalty as a fundamental demand of God's nature, who may be merciful but must be just. To Calvinistic conception, Christ's sacrifice was sufficient for all, but efficient only for the elect in whose behalf he died. The Socinians had subjected these views to a radical criticism, denying that God's nature demanded punishment, or that the penalty due to one could justly be met by the sufferings of another, ante, page 453. To the Socinian criticism Grotius now replied. God is a great moral ruler. Sin is an offense against his law. Like a wise earthly governor he may pardon if he chooses, but to pardon without making evident the regard in which he holds his law would be to bring that law into contempt. Hence Christ's death was not a payment for man's sin, that is freely forgiven, but a tribute to the sanctity of the divine government, showing that while God remits the penalty, he vindicates the majesty of his divine government. In that sense the sacrifice of Christ is no injustice. It is the divine tribute to offended law. Like a wise earthly ruler, God may offer pardon to all who will receive it on such terms as he chooses, for example, on condition of faith and repentance. The ingenuity of this theory is undeniable. It relieved the embarrassment of the Arminians caused by their assertion that Christ died for all. If that sacrifice was for all, and not for the elect only, and was a payment of the penalty for sin, why then were not all saved? Grotius gave answer by denying the payment of penalty. He also gave, in reply to the Socinians, a definite reason for the great sacrifice. Yet, of all the theories of the atonement this is the most theatrical and least satisfactory, for the message of the gospel is that in some true sense Christ died, not for general justice, but for me. Section 16. Anglicanism, Puritanism, and Congregation-equals-Alism in England. Episcopacy and Presbyterianism in Scotland. Queen Elizabeth's relations to the Catholics have been elsewhere considered, ante, page 438. Her position, at the beginning of her reign, was one of exceeding difficulty. With her people far from united in religious belief, with plots at home and enemies abroad, it was only by political maneuvering of extreme skillfulness that she was able to steer a successful course. Her difficulties were increased by the divisions which appeared, soon after the beginning of her reign, among those who accepted her rejection of Rome. These were augmented, as that reign advanced, by the quickened popular religious life which was transforming a nation that had been previously rather spiritually apathetic during the changes under Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary. Elizabeth purposely made the acceptance of her religious settlement as easy as possible. The Church, in its officers and services, resembled the older worship as fully as Protestant sentiment would tolerate. All but a fragment of its parish clergy conformed, and Elizabeth was well satisfied to leave them undisturbed in their parishes, provided they remained quiet, though their hearty acceptance of Protestantism was often doubtful and their capacity to preach or spiritual earnestness often dubious. From a political point of view her policy was wise. England was spared such wars as devastated France and Germany. From the first, the Queen was faced, however, by a more aggressive Protestantism. Man. As implying adoration of the physical presence of Christ therein, to the use of the ring in marriage as continuing the estimate of matrimony as a sacrament, and the sign of the cross in baptism as superstitious. Because they thus desired to purify the Church, this party, by 1564, was popularly called the Puritans. Led by Lawrence Humphrey, 1527–1590, president of Magdalen College, Oxford, and Thomas Sampson, 1517–1589, dean of Christ Church, Oxford, both Marian exiles, the earliest Puritan discussion was over the use of the prescribed garments, the Vestiarian controversy. Cambridge University sympathized largely with the Puritans. But in this matter the Queen's policy was strongly opposed to modification, and in 1566 Archbishop Parker issued his Advertisements, by which all preachers were required to secure fresh licenses from the bishops, controversial sermons forbidden, kneeling at communion required, and clerical dress minutely prescribed. Under these regulations a number of Puritan clergy were deprived of their positions. Among men who had learned in Zurich and Geneva to feel that any worship for which biblical warrant could not be found is an insult to the divine majesty, this led to a further position, a question whether an ecclesiastical system which deposed ministers who refused to use vestments and ceremonies not capable of scriptural demonstration was that which God intended for His Church. Furthermore, as they read their New Testament through Jean Van's spectacles, they saw there a definite pattern of church government quite unlike that existing in England, in which effective discipline was maintained by elders, ministers were in office with the consent of the congregation, and there was essential spiritual parity between those whom, as Calvin said, the Scriptures in describing them as bishops, presbyters, and pastors, uses the words as synonymous. It was the same conviction as to the essential equality of those in spiritual office that nerved Scottish Presbyterianism to its long fight with prelacy. The representative and leader of this second stage of Puritanism was Thomas Cartwright, 1535–1603. As Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity in Cambridge University in 1569, he advocated the appointment of elders for discipline in each parish, the election of pastors by their people, the abolition of such offices as archbishops and archdeacons, and the reduction of clergy to essential parity. That was practical Presbyterianism, and the more radical Puritans moved henceforth in the Presbyterian direction. The more moderate of the party continued their opposition to ceremonies and vestments without joining with Cartwright in a demand that the constitution of the English Church be altered. Cartwright's arguments aroused the opposition of the man who was to be the chief enemy of the early Puritans, John Whitgift, 1530–1604. Against Cartwright's assertion of jure divino Presbyterianism, Whitgift was far from asserting a similar authority for episcopacy. To him it was the best form of church government, but he denied that any exact pattern is laid down in the Scriptures, and affirmed that much is left to the judgment of the Church. By Whitgift's influence, Cartwright was deprived of his professorship in 1570, and the next year driven from the university. He lived thenceforth a wandering and persecuted life, much of the time on the continent, but laboring indefatigably to further the Presbyterian Puritan cause. The changes advocated by Cartwright were presented in an extreme but popularly effective pamphlet entitled An Admonition to the Parliament, written by two London ministers, John Field, 1588, and Thomas Wilcox, 1549–1608, in 1572. To it Whitgift replied, and was answered, in turn, by Cartwright. Presbyterian Puritanism was growing. To those more moderate than Cartwright, it seemed that it would require relatively little alteration of the existing churchly constitution. The obnoxious ceremonies c. Objections to the Queen's orders to forbid prophesyings. Cartwright and his fellow Puritans opposed all separation from the Church of England. Their thought was to introduce as much of Puritan discipline and practice as possible, and wait for its further reformation by the government. Such a hope did not seem vain. Within a generation, the constitution and worship of the Church of the land had been 4 times altered. Might it not soon be changed for a 5th time into what the Puritans deemed a more scriptural model? They would agitate and wait. This remained the program of the Puritans generally. Naturally, there were some to whom this delay seemed unjustifiable. They would establish what they conceived to be scriptural at once. These were the Separatists or early Congregationalists. On June 19, 1567, the authorities in London seized and imprisoned the members of such a separatist congregation, assembled for worship ostensibly to celebrate a wedding. This company had rejected the Church of England and had chosen at least two officers, Richard Fitz, minister, and Thomas Boland, deacon. It was evidently moving in the congregational direction. Whether remnants of this congregation maintained a subsequent corporate existence is not known. The first really conspicuous advocate of congregational principles in England was Robert Brown, 1550-1633, a student in Cambridge in the troublous time of Cartwright's brief professorship, and a graduate there in 1572. At first an advanced Presbyterian Puritan, he came to adopt separatist principles by about 1580, and in connection with a friend, Robert Harrison, founded a congregational church in Norwich in 1581. As a result of his preaching he found himself speedily in prison. He and the majority of his congregation sought safety in Middelburg, in the Netherlands. Here in Middelburg Brown had printed, in 1582, a substantial volume containing 3 treatises. One, directed against the Puritans who would remain in the Church of England, bears its burden in its title, A Treatise of Reformation without tarrying for any, and of the wickedness of those preachers which will not reform, till the magistrate command and compel them. Another, a book which sheweth the life and manners of all true Christians, presented the fundamental principles of Congregationalism. According to Brown, the only church is a local body of experiential believers in Christ, united to Him and to one another by a voluntary covenant. Such a church has Christ as its immediate head, and is ruled by officers and laws of His appointment. Each is self-governing and chooses a pastor, a teacher, elders, deacons, and widows, whom the New Testament designates, but each member has responsibility for the welfare of the whole. No church has authority over any other, but each owes to other brotherly helpfulness. The system thus outlined was essentially democratic, far more so than early Congregationalism in general was actually to be in its practice. Brown's system so closely resembles the views of the Anabaptists, page 368, that some connection in thought at least seems well nigh certain. Norwich, also, was largely populated by Dutch refugees. Yet Brown displayed no conscious indebtedness to the Anabaptists, and did not reject infant baptism. His emphasis on the covenant as the constitutive element in the church is much more positive than among the Anabaptists. The probable conclusion is that Brown owed much to a somewhat widely diffused Anabaptist way of thinking, rather than borrowed directly from any Anabaptist source. Brown's own stay in Holland was brief. His church was turmoiled, and after a period in Scotland he returned to England, where he conformed, outwardly at least, to the established church in October, 1585, and spent his long remaining life, from 1591 to 1633, in its ministry. With such a record of abandonment of early principles, it is no wonder that early Congregationalists resented the name Brownie. Extremely witty and exasperating, plainly of Puritan origin, though disliked by the Puritans generally. Issued in 1588 to 1589, and known as the Martin Marprelate Tracts, their authorship has never been fully ascertained, though probabilities point to Job Throckmorton, 1545 to 1601, a Puritan layman. Puritan and separatist assertion of the divine character of their systems was now rapidly producing a change of attitude in the leaders of their opponents, who may be called Anglicans. In his sermon at Paul's Cross, in London, in 1589, Richard Bancroft, 1544 to 1610, to be Whitgift's successor as Archbishop, not merely denounced Puritanism, but affirmed a jure divino right for episcopacy. Adrian Saravia, 1531 to 1613, a Walloon theologian domiciled in England, advocated the same view a year later, as did Thomas Bilson, 1547 to 1616, soon to be Bishop of Winchester, in his Perpetual Government of Christ's Church, in 1593. Less extreme was the learned Richard Hooker, 1553-1600, in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, of 1594. Though episcopacy is grounded in Scripture, his chief argument in its favor is its essential reasonableness, over against the extreme biblicism of the Puritans. The foundations of a high church party had been laid. The repression of Puritanism and separatism was greatly aided by the Court of the High Commission. From Henry VIII's time it had been a favorite royal expedient to control ecclesiastical affairs or persons by commissions appointed to investigate and adjudicate without being bound by the ordinary processes of law. The system was a gradual growth. Elizabeth developed it, and made it more permanent, but it did not become a thoroughly effective ecclesiastical court till Bancroft had become one of its members in 1587. By 1592 it had fully attained its powers. The presumption of guilt was against the accused, and the nature of proof was undefined. It could examine and imprison anywhere in England, and had become the right arm of episcopal authority. Meanwhile, Congregationalism had reappeared. In 1587 Henry Barrow, 1550-1593, a lawyer of London, and John Greenwood-1593, a clergyman, were arrested for holding separatist meetings in London. From their prison they smuggled manuscripts which appeared as printed treatises in Holland, attacking Anglicans and Puritans alike, and explaining congregational principles. A number were won, including Francis Johnson, 1562-1618, a Puritan minister. In 1592 a Congregational church was formed in London with Johnson as its pastor, and Greenwood as its teacher, and on April 6 of the next year Barrow and Greenwood were hanged for denying the Queen's supremacy in ecclesiastical matters. The same year Parliament passed a statute proclaiming banishment against all who challenged the Queen's ecclesiastical authority, refused to go to church, or were present at some conventicle where other than the lawful worship was employed. Under its terms most of the London Congregationalists were compelled to seek refuge in Amsterdam, where Johnson continued their pastor and Henry Ainsworth, 1571-1623, their teacher. The closing years of Elizabeth's reign also saw the beginnings of a reaction from the dominant Calvinism. By 1595 a controversy broke out in Cambridge, where Peter Barrow, 1534-1599, had been advocating views that would later have been called Arminian. This discussion led to the publication, under Whitgift's auspices, of the strongly Calvinistic Lambeth Articles. But the tendency to criticize Calvinism, thus started, increased, and through opposition to Puritanism, in part, was to become more and more characteristic of the Anglican party. Elizabeth closed her long reign on March 24, 1603, and was succeeded by Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James I, 1603-1625, who had already held the Scottish throne since 1567, as James VI. All religious parties in England looked with hope to his accession, the Catholics because of his parentage, the Presbyterian Puritans by reason of his leading Anglican disputant, besides the king himself, being Bancroft, now Bishop of London. No changes of importance desired by the Puritans were granted, except a new translation of the Bible, which resulted in the Authorized Version of 1611. They were ordered to conform. This Anglican victory was followed by the enactment by convocation, with royal approval, in 1604, of a series of canons elevating into church law many of the declarations and practices against which the Puritans had objected. The leading spirit here was Bancroft, who was soon to succeed Whitgift in the See of Canterbury, 1604-1610. The Puritans were now thoroughly alarmed, but Bancroft was more considerate in government than his declarations and previous conduct would have prophesied, and only a relatively small number of ministers, estimated variously from 49 to 300, were actually deprived. Anglicanism was gaining strength, also, from a gradual improvement in the education and zeal of its clergy, which Whitgift and Bancroft did much to foster, a conspicuous example being the learned, saintly, and eloquent Lancelot Andrewes, 1555-1626, who became Bishop of Chichester in 1605. Bancroft's successor as Archbishop was George Abbot, 16111633, a man of narrow sympathies and strong Calvinism, unpopular with the mass of the clergy, and himself in practical disgrace in the latter part of his episcopate. The loss of such strong hands as those of Whitgift and Bancroft was felt by the Anglicans, and under these circumstances, not only Puritanism but separatism made decided progress. A separatist movement of far-reaching ultimate consequences had its beginnings probably about 1602, in the work of John Smith, 1612, a former clergyman of the establishment, who had adopted separatist principles and now gathered a congregation in Gainsborough. Soon adherents were secured in the adjacent rural districts, and a second congregation gathered in the home of William Brewster, 1560-1644, at Scrooby. Of this Scrooby body William Bradford, 1590-1657, was a youthful member. From about 1604 it enjoyed the leadership of the learned and sweet-tempered John Robinson, 15752-1625, like Smith a former clergyman of the Puritan party in the Church of England, and like him led to believe separatism the only logical step. The hand of opposition being heavy upon them, the Gainsborough congregation, led by Smith, were self-exiled to Amsterdam, probably in 1607. That centered in Scrooby, under Robinson and Brewster's leadership, followed the same road to Holland, in 1607 and 1608, but established itself in 1609 in Leiden. At Amsterdam Smith came into contact with the Mennonites, and by his own study was convinced that their position rejecting infant baptism was that of primitive Christianity. In 1608 or 1609 he therefore baptized himself by pouring, and then the others of his church. Of unstable disposition, Smith soon after quarreled with his flock, but two of its members, Thomas Helwys, 1550-1616, and John Merton, 1625, led the return of a considerable portion to England, and established in London, in 1611 or 1612, the first permanent Baptist congregation on English soil. In the contemporary Dutch controversies they had adopted the Arminian position, and were therefore known as General Baptists. Apparently some remnants of the exiled Congregational Church of Johnson and Greenwood, Ante, page 463, kept up an organization in London, but the effective permanent replanting of Congregationalism in England was when Henry Jacob, 1563-1624, who had been of Robinson's congregation in Leiden, established a church in Southwark in 1616. From this church a portion seceded in 1633, on Baptist principles. They were Calvinists, and hence named Particular Baptists. By them immersion was practiced about 1641, and then spread to all English Baptists. The chief event in the history of the Leiden Congregational Church was the decision to send its more active minority to. In 1595, by Nicholas Bound, 1613, of his doctrine of the Sabbath, urging the perpetuity of the fourth commandment in Jewish rigor. Much Puritan hostility was, therefore, roused and that of Archbishop Abbot also when James I issued his famous Declaration of Sports, in 1618, in which he commended the old popular games and dances for Sunday observance. To the Puritan it seemed a royal command to disobey the will of God. Puritanism was steadily growing as a political force all through James's reign. The king's arbitrary treatment of Parliament, his failure to support effectively the hard-pressed Protestants of Germany in the opening struggles of the 30 Years' War, and above all, his ultimately unsuccessful attempts to procure marriage with a Spanish princess for his heir, were increasingly resented, and drove the Commons into a steadily growing political sympathy with Puritanism, the more that the Anglicans were identified largely with the royal policies. By the end of his reign, in 1625, the outlook was ominous. Nor was James's policy in his northern kingdom less fraught with future mischief. During James's childhood the Regent Morton, in 1572, had secured the nominal perpetuation of the episcopate largely as a means of getting possession of church lands. There were, therefore, bishops in name in Scotland. Their power was slight. In 1581, under the lead of Andrew Melville, the General Assembly had given full authority to presbyteries as ecclesiastical courts, and had ratified the Presbyterian Second Book of Discipline. In spite of James's opposition, the king and the Scottish Parliament had been compelled to recognize this Presbyterian system as established by law in 1592. Yet James was determined to substitute a royally controlled episcopacy for this largely self-governing Presbyterianism. He had the means at hand in the nominal bishops. By 1597 he was strong enough to insist that he alone had the right to call general assemblies, and his encroachments on Presbyterianism steadily grew. Melville and other leaders were exiled. The year 1610 saw a notable royal advance. James established 2 High Commission courts for ecclesiastical cases in Scotland, similar to that of England, and each with an archbishop at its head, and he procured from English bishops episcopal consecration and apostolical succession for the hitherto irregular Scottish episcopate. A pact parliament, in 1612, completed the process by giving full diocesan jurisdiction to these bishops. Thus far there had been no changes in worship, but 9 years later the king forced through a cowed General Assembly, and then through Parliament, kneeling at communion, confirmation by episcopal hands, the observation of the great church festivals, private communion and private baptism. Scotland was seething with religious discontent when James died. James I was succeeded, in England and Scotland, by his son Charles I, 1625–1649. A man of more personal dignity than his father, of pure family life, and of sincere religion, he was quite as exalted as James in his conceptions of the divine right of kings, arbitrary in his actions, and with no capacity to understand the drift of public sentiment. He was also marked by a weakness that easily laid him open to charges of double-dealing and dishonesty. From the first he enjoyed the friendship and support of one of the most remarkable men of the time, William Laud, 1573–1645. Laud had been, under James, a leader among the younger Anglicans. A vigorous opponent of Calvinism, he had argued as early as 1604, that there could be no true church without bishops. In 1622, in contest with the Jesuit, Fisher, he had held that the Roman Church was a true church, and a branch of the Catholic Church universal, of which the Church of England was the purest part. In many respects he was a founder of the Anglo-Catholic position, but it is not to be wondered that both the Puritans and the Roman authorities, to whom that view was then N.O.V. favor in both respects. Under Laud's guidance he promoted Arminians to church preferments. To prevent Calvinistic discussion, in 1628, he caused a declaration to be prefixed to the 39 Articles, that no man shall put his own sense on any article, but shall take it in the literal and grammatical sense. 1. Parliament resented these actions. Charles had proceeded to force taxation, imprisoning some who refused to pay. Roger Manwaring, 1590–1653, a royal chaplain, preached in 1627, arguing that as the king ruled as God's representative, those who refused taxes imposed by him were in peril of damnation. Parliament condemned Manwaring, in 1628, to fine and imprisonment, but Charles protected him by pardon and rewarded him by ecclesiastical advancement, ultimately by a bishopric. Questions of royal right to imprison without statement of cause, and of taxation, as well as of religion, embittered the relations of king and parliament, and after dismissing that of 1629, Charles determined to rule without parliamentary aid. No parliament was to meet till 1640. The weakness of the Anglican party was that it had identified itself with the arbitrary policy of the king. Laud, with the support of the king, enforced conformity with a heavy hand. Lectureships were broken up. Puritan preachers silenced. The Declaration of Sports was reissued. Under these circumstances many Puritans began to despair of the religious and political outlook, and to plan to follow the separatists across the Atlantic. It was no abstract religious liberty that they sought, but freedom to preach and organize as they desired. By 1628, emigration to Massachusetts had begun. In 1629, a royal charter for Massachusetts was secured, and a church formed in Salem. The year 1630 saw the arrival of many immigrants under the leadership of John Winthrop, 1588–1649. Soon there were strong churches about Massachusetts Bay, under able ministerial leaders, of whom John Cotton, 1584–1652, of Boston, and Richard Mather, 1596–1669, of Dorchester, were the most conspicuous. Connecticut colony was fully established in 1636, with Thomas Hooker, 1586–1647, as its chief minister at Hartford, and New Haven colony in 1638, under the spiritual guidance of John Davenport, 1597–1670. These men were clergy of the English establishment. They had no fondness for separatism. But, like the separatists, they looked on the Bible as the sole law of church organization, and they read it in the same way. Their churches were organized, therefore, on the congregational model. Till 1640, the Puritan tide to New England ran full, at least 20,000 crossing the Atlantic. Charles's period of rule without Parliament was a time of considerable prosperity in England, but taxes widely believed to be illegal, such as the famous ship money, and enforced religious uniformity, kept up the unrest. It was in Scotland, however, that the storm broke. James I had succeeded in his overthrow of Presbyterianism largely by securing the support of the nobles by grants of church lands. At the beginning of his reign Charles, by an act of revocation that was just, though impolitic, ordered the restoration of these lands, to the lasting advantage of the Scottish Church, though the command was imperfectly executed. Its political effect, however, was to throw the possessors of church lands and tithes largely on the side of the discontented Presbyterians. There was now a relatively united Scotland, instead of the divisions which James had fomented to his profit. Great as were the changes effected by James I, he had not dared alter the larger features of public worship, ante, page 467. But now, in 1637, in a fatuous desire for uniformity, Charles, inspired by Laud, ordered the imposition of a liturgy which was essentially that of the Church of England. Its use, on July 23, in Edinburgh, led to riot. Scotland flared in opposition. In February, 1638, a national covenant to defend the true religion was widely signed. November, 1640, the Long Parliament began its work. It was evident at once that Presbyterian Puritanism was in the majority. Laud was cast into prison. In July, 1641, the High Commission was abolished. In January, 1642, the attempt of the king to seize 5 members of the Commons, whom he accused of treason, precipitated the Civil War. In general, the North and West stood for the king, the South and East for Parliament. Parliament abolished episcopacy in January, 1643. Provision must be made for the creed and government of the Church, and therefore, Parliament, quite in the spirit of Elizabeth, as sovereign, called an assembly of 121 clergymen and 30 laymen, named by it, to meet in Westminster on July 1, 1643, to advise Parliament, which kept the power of enactment in its own hands. The Westminster Assembly, thus convened, contained a few Congregationalists and Episcopalians, but its overwhelming majority was Presbyterian Puritan. Meanwhile the war had begun ill for Parliament, and to secure Scottish aid the Solemn League and Covenant, pledging the largest possible uniformity in religion in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and opposing prelacy, was accepted by the Scottish and English parliaments between August and October, 1643, and was soon required of all Englishmen over 18 years of age. Scottish commissioners, without vote, but with much influence, now sat in the Westminster Assembly. The Assembly presented to Parliament a directory of worship and a thoroughly Presbyterian system of church government in 1644. In January following, Parliament abolished the prayer book and substituted the directory, which provided an order of worship substantially that used in conservative Presbyterian and Congregational churches to the present day, without liturgical prayer, though with suggestions of appropriate subjects of petition. Parliament looked askance at the establishment of Presbyterian government, though finally ordering it in June, 1646. The work was, however, very imperfectly set in operation. The same month that witnessed the abolition of the prayer book, saw the execution of Laud under a bill of attainder, an act which must be judged one of vindictiveness. The Assembly next prepared its famous Confession, which it laid before Parliament late in 1646. Adopted by the General Assembly of Scotland on August 27, 1647, it remains the standard of Scottish and American Presbyterianism. The English Parliament refused approval till June, 1648, and then modified some sections. In 1647, the Assembly completed 2 catechisms, a larger, for pulpit exposition, and a shorter, for the training of children. Both were approved by the English Parliament and the Scottish General Assembly in 1648. The Westminster Confession and Catechisms have always ranked among the most notable expositions of Calvinism. In general, they repeat the familiar continental type. On the question of the divine decrees they are infralapsarian, ante, page 454. One of their chief peculiarities is that in addition to the familiar derivation of original sin from the first parents as the root of all mankind, they emphasize a covenant of works and a covenant of grace. In the former, Adam is regarded as the representative head of the human race, to whom God made definite promises, which included his descendants, and which he, as their representative, forfeited by his disobedience for them as well as for himself. The covenant of works having failed, God offered a new covenant of grace through Christ. This covenant doctrine is to be traced to Caspar Olevianus, ante, page 443, though its fullest exposition was to be in the work of Johann Cocceius, 1603–1669, professor in Franeker and Leiden. It was an attempt to give a definite explanation of sin as man's own act, and to show a real human responsibility for his ruin. Another peculiarity of these symbols is an emphasis on the Sabbath consonant with the Puritan development of this doctrine. Why was as distasteful to the army as the older rule of bishops, and Cromwell fully shared this feeling. The army was soon demanding a large degree of toleration. This attitude of the army prevented the full establishment of Presbyterianism which Parliament sanctioned. It displeased the Scots. Charles now used this situation to intrigue with the Scots to invade England in his interest, inducing them to believe that he would support Presbyterianism. On August 17 to 19, 1648, the invading Scottish army was scattered by Cromwell near Preston. This victory left the army supreme in England. On December 6 following, Pride's Purge expelled from Parliament all opposed to the army's wishes. Charles I was then tried and condemned for his alleged treasons and perfidies, and beheaded on January 30, 1649, bearing himself with great dignity. Cromwell then subjugated Ireland in 1649, reduced Scotland the next year, and overthrew Charles's son, the later Charles II, 1660–1685, near Worcester in 1651. Opposition had been everywhere put down. Cromwell, though not identified wholly with any denomination, was practically a Congregationalist, or independent, and under his protectorate a large degree of toleration was allowed. Since the beginning of the war, however, about 2,000 episcopal clergymen had been deprived, and had suffered great hardship. Then as in earlier and later changes it is evident, nevertheless, that the great majority of the clergy either were undisturbed or managed to adjust themselves to the new state of affairs. Able, conscientious, and statesmanlike as Cromwell was, his rule was that of military authority, and was, as such, disliked, while the bickerings of rival religious bodies were equally distasteful to a great majority of the people of England who could, as yet, conceive of only one established form of faith. Till his death, on September 3, 1658, Cromwell suppressed all disaffection. Oliver Cromwell was succeeded by his son, Richard, as protector, but the new ruler was a man of no force, and practical anarchy was the result. Royalists and Presbyterians now combined to effect a restoration of the monarchy. On April 14, 1660, Charles I.T. issued a declaration of liberty to tender consciences, from Breda, and on May 29 was in London. But if the Presbyterians had just hopes of being included in the new religious settlement, they were doomed to bitter disappointment. Charles II may have intended some comprehension of Presbyterians in the national church. Edward Reynolds, 15991676, heretofore a decided Puritan, was made Bishop of Norwich. The saintly Richard Baxter, 1615–1691, one of the most eminent of the Presbyterian party, was offered a bishopric, but declined. A conference between bishops and Presbyterians was held by government authority at the Savoy Palace in 1661, but led to little result. Charles I.L. was thoroughly immoral, weak, and indifferent in religion, and little reliance could be placed on his promises. Had he been a better or a stronger man, it is doubtful whether he could have stemmed the tide of national reaction against Puritanism. The first Parliament chosen after his restoration was fiercely Royalist and Anglican. The Convocations of Canterbury and York met in 1661, and some 600 alterations were made in the Prayer Book, but none looking in the Puritan direction, and in May, 1662, the new Act of Uniformity received the royal assent. By it, the use of any other service than those of the Revised Prayer Book was forbidden under heavy penalties, and each clergyman was required, before August 24, to make oath of unfeigned assent and consent to all and everything contained and prescribed therein, and also, that it is not lawful, upon any pretense whatsoever, to take arms against the king. These provisions were intended to bar the Puritans from the church, and as such they were effectual. From 1500 to 2000 ministers gave up their places rather than take the prescribed oath. Were also forbidden to teach school about the only occupation readily open to a deprived minister. The Second Conventicle Act of 1670 made penalties for such unlawful attendance less severe, but ingeniously provided that the heavy fines on preacher and hearers could be collected from any attendant, in case poverty prevented their payment by all. Yet, in spite of this repression, dissenting preaching and congregations continued. Charles II, though a man of no real religion, sympathized with the Roman faith, which he professed on his deathbed, and his brother, the later James II, was an acknowledged and earnest Catholic from 1672. Moreover, Charles was receiving secret pensions from the strongly Catholic Louis XIV of France. On March 15, 1672, with a design of aiding the Catholics and securing dissenting favor to that end, Charles issued, on his own authority, a declaration of indulgence, by which Protestant dissenters were granted public worship, the penal laws against the Catholics remitted, and their worship permitted in private houses. To Parliament this seemed an unconstitutional favor to Rome. It forced the withdrawal of the indulgence, in 1673, and passed the Test Act, which, though aimed at Catholics, bore hard on Protestant dissenters. All in military or civil office, with few minor exceptions, living within 30 miles of London, were required to take the Lord's Supper according to the rites of the Church of England or forfeit their posts. This statute was not to be repealed till 1828. The repression of dissent, therefore, continued unchanged till the death of Charles I, in 1685. For James II, 1685 to 1688, it must be said that he saw in the establishment of Catholicism his chief aim, and his measures, though unwise, were courageous. He ignored the Test Act, and appointed Catholics to high office in military and civil service. He brought in Jesuits and monks. He secured from a packed court of the King's Bench, in 1686, an acknowledgment of his right to dispense with all penal laws in particular cases. He re-established a High Commission Court. On April 4, 1687, he issued a declaration of indulgence, granting complete religious toleration. In itself it was a well-sounding, and from the modern standpoint, a praiseworthy act. Yet its motives were too obvious. Its ultimate aim was to make England once more a Roman Catholic country, and all Protestantism was alarmed, while lovers of constitutional government saw in it a nullification of the power of Parliament by arbitrary royal will. The vast majority of dissenters, though relieved thereby from grievous disabilities, refused to support it, and made common cause with the churchmen. When, in April, 1688, James II ordered the indulgence read in all churches, 7 bishops protested. They were put on trial and, to the delight of the Protestants, acquitted. James had taxed national feeling too greatly. William of Orange, 1650 to 1702, the stadtholder of the Netherlands, who had married Mary, James's daughter, was invited to head the movement against James. On November 5, 1688, he landed with an army. James fled to France. The revolution was accomplished, and on February 13, 1689, William, IIT, and Mary were proclaimed joint sovereigns of England. The clergy of the Restoration had asserted too long the doctrines of the divine right of kings and of passive obedience to royal authority to make this change palatable. 7 bishops, headed by William Sancroft, 1616 to 1693, refused the oath of allegiance to the new sovereigns, and with them about 400 clergy. To them James II was still the Lord's anointed. They were deprived, as Anglicans and dissenters had been before, and they bore themselves with equal courage. Many of them were men of earnest piety. They formed the Non-Juror Party, which gradually died out. Under the circumstances of the Revolution of 1688, toleration could no longer be denied to Protestant dissenters. By the Toleration Act of May 24, 1689, all who SWO completed till 1829. In Scotland, the Restoration was a time of great turmoil and suffering. The Parliament of 1661 annulled all acts affecting religion passed since 1633. Episcopacy was, therefore, restored as in the time of Charles I. In September, 1661, 4 bishops were appointed, chief of them James Sharp, 1618-1679, as Archbishop of St. Andrews. Consecration was obtained from England. Sharp had been a Presbyterian minister, but had betrayed his party and his church. All officeholders were required by Parliament to disown the covenants of 1638 and 1643. In 1663 Parliament enacted heavy fines for absence from the now episcopally governed churches, though even it did not dare introduce a liturgy. Many Presbyterian ministers were now deprived, especially in southwestern Scotland. When their parishioners absented themselves from the ministration of the new appointees, they were fined, and if payment was not forthcoming, soldiers were quartered on them. In 1664 a High Commission Court was added to the instruments of repression. 2 years later some of the oppressed supporters of the covenants of 1638 and 1643, or Covenanters, engaged in the Pentland Rising. It was ruthlessly crushed, and the Presbyterian element treated with increasing severity. On May 3, 1679, in belated retaliation, Sharp was murdered. This crime was speedily followed by an armed rising of Covenanters, but on June 22 the revolt was crushed at Bothwell Bridge and the captured insurgents treated with great cruelty. 6 months later the king's brother, James the later James II of England was practically put in charge of Scottish affairs. The extremer and uncompromising Presbyterians were now a proscribed and hunted folk, known as Cameronians, from one of their leaders, Richard Cameron. The accession of James II, or Seven, as he was numbered in Scotland, but intensified at first the repression of the Cameronians. His first year was the killing time, and the Parliament of 1685 made death the punishment for attendance at a conventicle. James, however, soon pursued the same course as in England. He filled his council with Catholics, and in 1687 issued letters of indulgence granting freedom of worship. As in England, this release of Catholics from penalty aroused the hostility of all shades of Protestants. Episcopalians and Presbyterians were alike opposed, and when William and Mary mounted the throne of England they had many friends in the northern kingdom. Scotland was more divided than England, however. The Stuarts were Scotch, and though Episcopalians disliked the Catholicism of James they distrusted the Calvinism of Dutch William, whom the Presbyterians favoured. The Revolution triumphed, however, and on May 11, 1689, William and Mary became rulers of Scotland. In 1690 Parliament restored all Presbyterian ministers ejected since 1661, ratified the Westminster Confession, ante, page 472, and declared Presbyterianism the form recognized by the government. This legal establishment of Presbyterianism was opposed by the Cameronian laity, who continued their hostility to any control of the Church by civil authority and condemned the failure to renew the covenants, and by the Episcopalians, who were strong in northern Scotland. The latter, however, though in the status of a dissenting body, were permitted by a Toleration Act of 1712, to use the English liturgy. In both England and Scotland the long quarrels between Protestants were, therefore, adjusted in